Hello. To be, to have been, and to continue to be in an artistic, creative sense means to renew yourself, to rethink your ways, to not accept the status quo. Perhaps it's human nature to constantly repeat what you think people like. Perhaps it's human nature to respond to the reflection of the mirror from the others. Perhaps it's flattering, and in any sense it's rewarding. I guess, even if I personally think competition in general, while helpful in terms of the healthy ambition, becomes unhealthy when the pyramidal result is at the top extremely thin. It's a machine to discourage. So what's left other than the inner ritual life? What is but the necessity to bring out from one's instinct, perhaps you call it gift, talent, some people call as they want. But the fact is that something drives you to better yourself in order to serve what you think is worth all your life search, in this case musical interpretation, perhaps composition, perhaps you call it anything you want also, transcription, interpretation through perhaps transposition, transcription, and ultimately improvisation. It really doesn't matter, but the point is, I find that a lot of people reach a point where they satellize themselves on a satellization level, and it creates a sense of exclusive circle. And it takes then some kind of eccentricity or some kind of unusual, extra musical, but possibly within music artistic, perhaps drive to enter or break that closed circle and be included. So it creates a sense of elite and then the others. And when you observe in history, of course, media has always been originally rumor, then gossip, then flattery, then fan clubs, then opposite groups of supporting like sports teams, artistic personalities. And then the whole in-between musical critics or music organizers of events, competitions or festivals, which sort of the viewing mirror of the of the competition's results. All this, it's been always there, and I find it incredibly important to transmit, to give to the next generation as a teacher, the timelessness of the depth of thinking of what humbly we're trying to do. Transmit is one thing, share, give, openly give food for thought to others without self-indulging, without desire to be imitated, or in a way, it's a very striking fact that in the most of the second half of the 20th century, the great performers in classical music were not teachers, possibly because of the fame compared to or combined with the high incomes that flatters the egos at every level of, having succeeded in life, compared to the more tedious, daily, sometimes mostly in the shadows, teaching, the results of which are not immediate. Far from there. Take decades for the seeds to blossom in the given student's own trajectory forward, artistically or in any way. I think that it's difficult to renew oneself playing the same series of pieces, even if I believe very much in the fact that they never be played as well as we were taught or we grew up to think that they should be. So therefore, why not keep trying every year, every 2 years, and replay them and reorganize them and rethink them and re-record them? Yes, that's true. The problem is very often nowadays is that there is a standardization of the approach of playing, a rationalization of the essential goal, which is to play clean. And that is the key to competitions, since this is the lowest but only denominator, because nobody else agrees on an artistry because it's so peculiarly unique, and so it can brush against the ones and please the others, but never know. And young students, therefore competitors, in all these hopes for going through the filter to a career, which is sort of the grail, inevitably get into this rational playing. That means that, in a way, minimizing the risk of the unknown. Well, you have to still deal with it, on the unexpected of the stage performance. The more you rationalize it in practicing, the more you cover your tracks. So you think that you are, at that point, not going to be susceptible to fail because of an emotion, positive or negative, of a stage fright or the pressure of an event, and deliver regardless where and when and how, always the same way. And I find that it all goes down back to the hearing, because if most pianists hear through their fingers, it's because they repeat practicing the sections until they mnemotechnically learn them. In other words, it becomes a muscular memory, it's a cognitive memory. It disconnects little by little by the repetitivity, which is inevitably extremely dulling, if not maddening, at high levels of practicing, besides being dangerous for the hands in terms of the muscular and the tendons wearing. Is that then you disconnect the hearing in order to reproduce digitally the situation precisely. So the fingerings are locked in, which is good. The choices are done according to the topography of the terrain, as I like to say, for the keyboard. And then in accordance to the morphology of the hand of the specific pianist. So once you lock in this and you get the stage experience and you play often the same piece, you learn how to manage the unexpected constantly. But there is one thing that happens in that process, is that while you become reliable, which is the dream of all my students when they go to competitions, to be reliable and clean and play as you practiced, as they like to say. In other words, without the pressure on the stage. I think that at this point, the hearing disconnecting, or disconnected rather than disconnecting, comes down to a sensation of fingertips and the stylistic meaning, the refreshing and surprising, beautifully, I mean, inspiring harmonic progressions or melodic input of the thematic material doesn't disturb. Because in fact it does if you let yourself get, when you go, oh, I love this piece, you lose your rationale. You have to be detached by the industry of playing from the emotional or spiritual and altogether human connection to what the piece means to you while you play it, not to be distracted. And it's becoming like a separation of the technical from the artistic, as if in some rare cases we have the opportunity to have both. When you don't fear the mistake and you rediscover the melodic line, which reveals itself differently because of a slight difference of tempo, acoustic instrument. And of course, if you lock off your ears to concentrate on your fingers in order to play cognitively right and clean and correct, yes, it's very impressive. And because of the recording industry that made digital editing the the basic condition for any release, so everybody plays clean. Perhaps not on stage, obviously, because you cannot edit your playing on stage in real time. Though I think with artificial intelligence we might get to that point too. But there is the moment of retelling the story as if every time is the first time or the only time. That's even more meaningful. So yes, I do that for my students. Fingerings, phrasing, positions of the wrist, preposition of the arms, thinking ahead each section before you arrive into it so that you negotiate it technically at its best, as if when you practice the section alone. But in the flow of the events, you have to think ahead with another line of thoughts that are it's like the conductor of your own self, anticipating the new tempo with a new upbeat. And so you count ahead or you think ahead and your fingers play in real time while you observe the playing without, well, of course you have to monitor with your ears in real time. But if you're too much into the listening while you play, then you lose the thinking ahead, especially separated from or differentiated from the musical, emotional impact of the piece. Yeah. I think both are possible, not separately. Oh, so musical, but too bad he was not clean. Or, oh, it wasn't very musical, but my God, everything was in place. I hear these comments so often from colleagues and in general, I mean. So, you know, beware of what you wish. You want to have competitions crank out pianists that are impeccable in terms of the industry of playing. That is impressive. They play like a recording as if they were edited in real time, but they play the same way in order to do so. They don't change, they don't take any musical inspiration on the very moment they play, because they locked in so much the bolts of every aspect that could bring a mistake by an unorganized or unplanned gesture shifting, content preparation, pre-touch of the key. And of course, when they play mostly pieces that are extremely ergonomical, if I like what to say, or some very like, Prokofiev and Bartok, concerti and Stravinsky pieces, which have all this kind of and modern music. Well, modern is all relative, but like ligeti etudes and onwards, compared to playing Schubert piece. Oh, but yes, then it's poetry, they say it. But they say it almost with a certain, well, they, depends who are the they. Some would say, oh, it's more poetic, you know. But I think that it is true. Music is everything. It's a language for humanity, or the human experience, rather. Uplifting, or in a way arrogantly exciting, and why not? That's the human nature too. It's the essence of just living. And if some pieces valorize that is beautiful too. And when it's beautifully played, regardless of the tastes of the individual people and others who could think that they own the tastes, according to this or that tradition, okay. I mean, that's why I think perhaps that's naive, and I'm convinced that I'm being utopian. There is room for everybody. Of course, that's not true when you look at the pyramidal, as I said, thin tip, when the competitions in life, as well as the competition themselves, reach a point where so many are rejected for so few who are, let's say, recognized, and who hold on till they repeat themselves constantly. The most reliable way, which is not really renewed. And that sounds very judgmental of mine. Perhaps I should say that the fact that most of the ones who are admired by my students, for instance, of the concert performers of the day, besides the recorded of the dead famous ones of the past, are usually not teaching actively. Perhaps a class, master class in a festival here or there, more for the show. But in terms of the continuous day by day teaching, yeah, it's not as much rewarding for them. But on the other hand, I believe that when somebody plays with the phrasing, the touch, the articulation, the musicianship, the right tone, the stylistic feeling, the fact that you listen to somebody's culture and cultivated ways of playing, and all that makes you enthused and you start becoming a fan, then that's marvelous. In a way, you learn by the example. But that is not the case for teaching, where you also, as a student, learn by the concepts or the points of view of the teacher that you agree or not, and then the phrasings, the fingerings, the pedaling, the general idea about tempo and rubato and pulse and rhythm, and how to organize your memorization, and all kinds of technical things about independence of fingers, independence of hearing of the voices, capacity of voicing compared to capacity of playing under dynamics that are usually not visited because they might not speak, repeated notes, melodic or not, or loud chords or notes or shiftings without to bang, by shifting, anticipating, and touching before you reach. In other words, plethora of ingredients, food for thought, and practical applications. Of course, you give examples when you play, mostly to prove a point by an exaggeration, in order to direct the attention of the student towards what you think the student should avoid. And it's each time individually really tailored. It's not universal. Some things are universal. Obviously, most fingers come with hands come with 5 fingers, but that's beyond the fact, because the fingers are uneven. The tendons don't distribute the same way. The way each finger doesn't have the same amount of independence energy at the get-go. yes, we try to do that. So the technical aspect plus the artistic aspect, which in a way is innate but has to be nurtured, and then there is the cultivated understanding of the context of the music you play, since today we play music for so many centuries that the past people played mostly the music of their day. And so we enter in all these complexities which once digested, of course some people choose to ignore them and they say I play the piano regardless which style because I play the notes. And if it's written for lute, originally for organ, or for, I don't know, it doesn't matter because I play it on the piano, so I play it as a piano piece, not as a translated transposition or some kind of intelligent understanding. I mean, yes, they have also those who prefer to not play at all music on the modern instrument, not written for it. And so between the universalism and the niches in which interestingly one can sink, and deeply so, to understand the articulation, how people heard the music in the time when it was written, and how we will play it on today's instrument for the ears of today that have heard way more dissonances than at the time. And so to reach to the freshness of the meaning, of the surprise, of the audacities of a given time period demands also to exclude oneself from what we have heard since it was written, in order to plunge ourselves in the way it was perceived and heard by the people and the person who wrote it, and the people who heard it or practiced it and played it then. The beauty of it is that there is no one single way, right way to grow up in music. Some are children prodigies, some are not. Some study the technique and music and add it like layers on a sandwich and organize it and become very well trained by technical standards. Some others learn music in some kind of a disorder of elements. They are attracted by one thing that drives them to learn more of it, and then they go to something else, and realizing the gaps, they fill them up with different ways. You know, you can get it from a recording or from an experience or of a person, and you combine until somehow you get to what you can bring best, or an added value to the same piece that others people play. Or then you totally go away from the performance and you become an interpreter of your own inventions, in which case it's either jazz, which is mostly accepted today for interpretation of something that is considered there basically openly improvisation, and then within the classical music, locked in the score, you can do an interpretation but not an improvisation, without which you will be out of the tracks. And so how to renew yourself while you retell the notes of the others, while the other branch is very endless variations on the theme of a tune, but with your own improvisation. And then in the jazz, people value the difference, and in the classical, people value in a way the alikeness. And then they want to extract out of it some uniqueness. But it's sort of paradox. It's a paradox. Everything is a paradox. Mainly is the fact that nobody has time to study long enough to infuse all these elements until they find through their own path of life this kind of philosophic approach to the meaning of all of that. And then when they play, they glow out of them. It glows what they are. They are the piece while they play. They are the thoughts of the composer while they play. They become a sense of momentary truth of the piece's meaning, regardless if you accept or not. But it's so compelling that you go, oh, that's incredible. It just touches and feels touches all the points that I think the piece should have touched. I wish I could do it, or, oh, I don't agree, but wow. And that doesn't happen so fast, even if intuition is a great speeder of progress when you're very young, because the neurons are so fast and everything here is a sponge through the ears of music and the fingers with the speed of connection between the neurons and the fingers. So you sight read faster, you learn faster, you memorize faster, you grow faster. But not everybody can do that so faster. And there are so many ways to serve music other than to serve yourself in music, in the sense of, besides teaching, I mean. And that's, of course, to play with others, singers, instrumentalists, chamber groups, prepare opera singers. In other words, contribute to the music world through the keyboard with skills that extend and beyond. You have to know languages for the opera coaching, you have to know the very operas themselves, and you have to learn about how to teach the singers with their relative pitch if they don't always have perfect. And that doesn't have to do with the organ that makes them great singers, their voice. So yes, of course, you have to learn to transpose. Of course, the machines today transpose for you, so you don't need to read in 7 clefs to learn how to transpose for the different vocal necessities. And of course, this kind of repertoires you specialize in usually later. While when we're young, you all want to be Horowitz or Rubinstein or whoever is your admired pianist as a concertist. But it would be also great if there was enough culture and enough output for accompanist pianists to value so much that they study and learn the accompaniment repertoires during all this building musical and technical skill years of theirs. Fortunately, it doesn't happen so, but then they scramble it at some point to make a living, instead of having built it slowly and in depth. And if you ask a student to study, let's say Schubert or Schumann or Fauré song cycle, and who is enrolled in a master's or diploma degree or a doctoral degree in a major school of music or piano department with ambition for competitions, winning, in other words, there is a healthy ambition, as I like to say it always, because not all ambitions are healthy, but generally it's a good drive. They would consider that, oh, that means you don't think I'm good enough to play Tchaikovsky concerto, right? When it's so beautiful to do both, to consider both at the same level, to give them the same nobility of necessity. But it's a mentality thing. Perhaps it's human nature, it's the ego and the fact that it seems to be a secondary road for the not successful soloists. You can go conductor if you cannot continue playing, or you think you've reached a plateau, and then use your musical instincts and knowledge to ask the others to play it if they engage you to conduct them. Or then you teach, and if you don't play, or you don't play very much, but then you teach the art of learning how to learn, how to study, how to organize, how to prepare. In other words, you teach the alphabet of the know-how. I mean, it's part of the job, and in fact that's what it is to be a craftsman of one's art. And I think that with generations now that are coming up after so many competitions and so much mediatization and so many videos and so many recordings compared to a century ago, I think that the younger generation are more versatile and consider more naturally the importance of becoming a good quality solo performer as well as a well-prepared, they call it collaborative pianist, which I think is just a way to political correctness not to say an accompanist, which they consider to be perhaps inevitably considered pejoratively belittling. He's an accompanist. But that's a good hope. I think it's a good hope. It's a good hope. Thankfully, there is not one single way to build a musical life. For each individual case, it's a different path. Some lead to dead end, alas. Some accidents of life happen in that sense. And a lot of disappointments happen too, when a lot of hopes are shattered by the constant competitivity that sort of filters everything of all the efforts. And some will be weaker and give up because it's difficult to swim against the tide. At some point you give up. They don't want me, so I'll just give up. But you keep it anyway, perhaps in your inner world more than the outer world of presenting yourself to play. And in a way, there's a calling for music, but there's also an industry of music, and there is a craftsmanship of how to play music, and then there is a competitivity to emerge among the others, as if there is no room for everybody. So this elitism becomes a sort of a grail for which people dream of, but in fact is quasi-fake, because ultimately, and that is the hardest thing every human being has to accept to do, is look at yourself in the mirror and wonder, is it worth what I'm doing? Am I doing it at the extent of which I would expect others to do? Easy to criticize everybody, right? And easy to be sort of, perhaps for survival instinct, which is healthy too, forgiving to oneself. But to build a healthy musician with a great talent and a strong character with healthy values and practicing quality aesthetics and morale and humility, true one, not faked, and repertoire choosing intelligently in order to play certain things at certain point, not just because you can, but because you should, and others too early because you still can or could, but perhaps you don't grasp. But that's okay, because it's so competitive that if you don't seize the opportunity, then you wouldn't play at all. And so then you end up playing something half-baked or well-prepared, but then it takes you years to realize that, in fact, you only scratch the surface of it, which is fine, because in a way you have to seize the unexpected opportunity, and that is part of being also a human being, regardless of how competitive or not the classical music world is. I still would like to make sure that everybody remembers that classical music, as they call it for the classical part, is reflective for the listener as well as for the performer. It's not only distracting, it's not only entertaining. Oh, it could be. And it's a beautiful ingredient in it. It's the lightness of life. It's the frivolity of life. I mean, why not? That's part of it too. It can be deep and at the same time frivolous. That's the human nature. And I think it's beautiful. And some compositions reflect that. Not all of them are just one or the other. And the elegance of presenting all this sparkle of life through different compositions, styles. Sometimes people have preconceived wrong opinions that, oh yeah, it's older music, so obviously it's this or that. Sometimes the oldest music is way more challenging and modern and fresh and seems more instinctive and less organized only. Of course, everything is an organization in a certain way when you arrange notes and you put them on the staff. it's again an exclusion of all the other notes, right? Or when you improvise, it's a bit easier because you sort of go everywhere, and then you have to be so editing yourself in real time. But all these reflections, I think, call for a very humble listening to the others, and helpful when they ask you for your advice for them, and not as you would like them to be like you. No matter how much you could find sometimes similarities, say, oh, it reminds me of how I was when I was young. Okay, that's good. I mean, it's human, it's God, and again, something wrong with it. But really, to not try to clone the others and train them, but really, make them become who they wish to be. And help them also when they have drop downs after disappointments. Return from competition, not played as well as they wished at a concert audition, job audition, or hearing. To be resentful and keep going on, keep believing, not in you only, but in what drives you through music to play it. Perhaps you'll find meaninglessness to fight a fight for which you don't want to fight. Not everybody is a fighter when they start music. Usually, actually, most of them aren't. But then the competitive instinct, I guess, comes already early within beginners classes, and then further into every levels of school juries, until then international juries, until then position teaching juries. In other words, you're constantly proving yourself, which is a good, healthy way of avoiding the status quo. And it's harder as the age goes on, because you sort of stiffen or stabilize, or sort of, you become less flexible to rethink the paradigm and say, okay, I'm going to rethink the piece another way. Perhaps I was playing it what I thought was right, but in fact, or my teacher thought, I reject the teacher, I reject the way I thought of it, I'll rethink it. And that's so incredibly humbling and difficult to do. Of course, if you have many concerts, you reproduce only what you already do, because you know you're good at it. People expect of you. Again, you're the mirror reflection of what people expect of you. And if you try to think of repertoires, or the same or new, or the same but revisited, for the sake of it, no. But just because you find that perhaps at some point you're tired of repeating it, in order to be reliably always good, you end up by repeating it, not only the piece, but reproducing the way you play it, the way you shift it, touch it, prepare it, anticipate it, count it, tempo it, everything. And that's probably where the most important comes in play, which is to adapt to your personal human growth as a human being, your perception of the world, of the things, the philosophy, the understanding, the misunderstanding, what you thought was what now you don't think is. And it reflects in the way you play what you played and that you replay now, or how you think of it while you teach. Because inevitably by teaching, either if you don't try to explain it, but you try to convey it, the student reflects it by their own on you, and you realize, oh, I should have thought of that at their age. And they reveal you the piece ways you didn't think of it. So in a way, that's what I think is one of the most humbling and inspiring things about teaching, is the exchange with a younger person who therefore visits the piece for their first time. And you don't just only, well, certain things you repeat to them, but most of the time between the words you think and you say, oh, I should have tried that. I will do that now. And I find that incredibly beautiful, because that doesn't happen on stage when you play for others. It's a one way. Of course, you feel the emotional I would say, contained breath of the audience, listening quality of you, and of the piece through you, obviously. Hopefully you don't think is of you, but let's say, why not? Let's accept to be not humble. They came for me, I play for them, and then after that we all leave. But when you teach, it's for one or several together, sitting there and playing, and you rethink the piece, you reorganize the thoughts about what it is about, you think, and what is the context it was about. And once you enter into the details and then you go back to the whole, you rediscover the piece that you already knew, that you experienced, which they discovered the experience of. And yes, while it's asymmetrical, it is still very importantly two-way, unlike the performing. And that's why I'm so filled with gratitude for my teachers. Filled with gratitude for my teachers. And will never be enough thankful to my parents and to my teachers for having taken the time in their own lives to help me build mine. Which is why I do that 24/7, so to say, with today's systems of being able to connect with all time zones. You can teach a lesson in the other side of the earth. And so the times are no more relevant. So it almost feels like 24/7, it's just a way of speaking, of course. It brings to the world, for the world, well-crafted, deeply musical in the sense of their earnestness, young generation of musicians whose artistry glows from their own being through their carefully and longly filtered through their psyche musical expression of the various repertoires which they will irrigate the musical world of music lovers, listeners. And I find that this teaching is in fact humanistically way more meaningful for the human beings of the future who will be their listeners, who will share the fruits of the most beautiful inspiration of uplifting spirit of humanity that the composers who wrote the pieces which we play gave us as a gift to pass on. And that gift is so way more meaningful, because then somebody in a concert hall or virtually on a recorded screen, regardless the mean, will be touched by the humanity or the expression of some deep yearning that this very human being of a future year would need to or feel like through the media of connecting to the music of a performer playing, of a composer who expressed perhaps similar, outside of the context of the time, human experience expressions of emotions, love, hate, hope, despair, death, birth, rebirth. And this, I think, is way more meaningful than only the short-term competitive tip of the pyramid race, rat race. Of course, it's not as appealing to give as a goal to a student than to say, in 2 years you win this competition, you have 80 concerts a year, your fame and your fortune are made, and you'll be there for the next as many decades as you can play so well all these pieces. in order to become then at some point an icon, and people will just want to be like you and nobody will question you. Perhaps you won't question yourself. And that's perhaps one of the dreams of humanity, is to perpetuate themselves. It's of course more challenging to say, what about rethinking the piece and questioning yourself to the core of your being, and say, I will want to hope to perhaps one day finally play and fulfill all what the piece means to me, besides what I'm told to think the piece should mean to me, or I was taught, or I was influenced, or I was enticed into through different times of my life. And then you feel a sense of fulfillment that you managed to do it by yourself. You could also feel that fulfillment by seeing how the student, after growing all the grains that you placed in their thought process of their own blossoming, send you a recording, or perhaps you hear a concert of theirs and you realize that you accomplished yourself, perhaps not by playing it as you wished, but your student finished by playing it in the way you might have wished, but even more, because it's themselves and not you. It's not about a reflection of yourself, all about me. It's about how they managed to summarize and go forward. And you feel proud because you feel like you contributed a little bit to it. It's not about vanity or about ego. That is more about the immediate situation of playing in front of people and becoming the piece for them, but the piece is more than you, but you know it. But while you're there and the piece's author isn't, you are the one to be the mediator. So yes, when it's remote through the dead composer, you hyphen to the performer student who will become a master, then you have long time lived enough to see some of your students become masters. Then you feel that you fulfilled very humbly the chain of generations of humanity since its beginning. It's in the global aspect of times, it's a blink of an eye, but in the few decades of life on earth that you're given to live, you feel like you did something to pass it forward. And I find that to be the most rewarding. That's why for self-indulgence, I love to play. But for challenging understanding, and therefore the alterity, the other, is another level of reward, way different. It doesn't happen all the time. As a matter of fact, it happens very rarely. Both actually happen very rarely, but somehow it's a goal, and sometimes it's a hope. And it's different for each person to experience at which level they place what in their hierarchy of values or expectations of life's rewards. Everybody should not try to search to match. After all, it means very differently everything to each person. What is meaningful, what drives them? Desire? Probably at the bottom of it, yes. And then accomplishment through others, for others. Perhaps it's because I received so much that I give so much, but that doesn't mean that in the quantity of giving there is quality. So I try to constantly rethink the way I valorize specific elements in a performing in piano. I don't stay rigidly connected to only my earlier understanding of it. I don't lose my core values. I'm enough humble to accept to question them. And I think that reflects in a way on the student. Of course, everybody is differently equipped with different levels of, concentration capacity, as well as being able to be confident, not overconfident, but not threatened, and not insecure, though insecurity is part of not being threatened. I mean, obviously all these psychological matters are very subtle and personal and individually shaping the trajectory of different performing musicians in classical music. But yeah, pass the gift forward. Thank you.